When my grandmother looked at my son Diego and whispered, "He has the same eyes as the other boy, the one I let die," I felt the world stop. I had been taking care of her for 2 years as Alzheimer slowly consumed her, watching her forget names, dates, and the faces of people she had loved her entire life. But in that moment, in front of my 7-year-old son, her memory brought back something that had been buried for more than 40 years. Something no one in the family knew. Something she had guarded so carefully that not even the disease had been able to erase it. Until that day. I'm Patricia. I'm 61 years old, and I thought I knew my family's history. I thought I knew who my grandmother Alina was, that sweet and strong woman who raised 5 children alone after my grandfather died in an accident. But it turns out we all have secrets, and some are so dark that only a sick mind is capable of releasing them. What I discovered that day changed everything I believed about my family. It changed the way I looked at old photos, at the stories told during Christmas dinners, and the worst part is that when I tried to look for answers, I realized that the only person who could confirm them could no longer distinguish reality from her own ghosts. My grandmother had given me a confession and then hid behind her illness, leaving me alone with a secret that weighed on my chest like stones. A secret about a boy no one talked about, a boy who supposedly never existed. If this story is pulling you in as much as living it pulled me in, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone. Comment what you would do in my place, because I still don't know if I did the right thing. Stay until the end, I beg you, because what I discovered was much worse than I imagined. It was a Sunday afternoon when I took Diego to visit his great-grandmother at the San Rafael nursing home in Puebla. We made this visit every 2 weeks because the doctor said maintaining family contact was important, even though grandmother barely recognized anyone anymore. That particular day, the heat was suffocating. The air conditioning in the facility was broken, and all the residents were irritable and confused. We found her sitting in her wheelchair by the window, staring at the garden with that empty expression I had learned to accept. "Hi, Grandma, it's Patricia," I said as I approached and took her wrinkled hand. She looked at me with no recognition, but smiled in that automatic way people with dementia do. Then Diego approached, my beautiful son with his honey-colored eyes and messy brown hair, as always. And everything changed. Grandmother looked at Diego and something lit up behind her clouded eyes. It wasn't the usual confusion. It was something different, deeper, terrifying. She leaned forward in her chair and reached out a trembling hand toward my son. "Come here, boy," she said in a voice clearer than anything she had spoken in months. Diego looked at me for permission, and I nodded, not knowing what else to do. He stepped closer with the innocent bravery children have, and grandmother cupped his face in her hands. "You have the same eyes," she whispered, and I saw tears beginning to run down her wrinkled cheeks. The same eyes as the boy I let die. My heart stopped. "What boy, Grandma?" I asked, trying to stay calm even though I felt something terrible was about to be revealed. But she no longer heard me. She only stared at Diego as if he were a ghost. "My son Roberto," she said, caressing Diego's face with a tenderness that contrasted horribly with her words. "My little Roberto, who got sick and I did nothing. I left him there in bed, burning with fever, because your grandfather said doctors were too expensive. $200, that was all we needed, but he said we didn't have it." I felt the ground shift under my feet. Roberto was my father's name, but I had never heard of another Roberto in the family. "Roberto, what child are you talking about?" I insisted, but she had already closed her eyes and was rocking back and forth. "He was 3, she continued, as if reciting something memorized decades ago. 3 years old, and he died in 2 days while I watched him suffer. And after that, You were born, Patricia, and I gave you the name of the saint I prayed to so she would forgive me." That night, after putting Diego to bed, who thankfully had not fully understood what his great-grandmother said, I sat at my computer and began searching. I looked through family birth records that my Aunt Lucia had digitized years earlier when she built the family tree. I searched through the names of Grandmother Alina and Grandfather Thomas's children. Officially, they had 5 children: my father Roberto, my Aunt Lucia, my Uncle Fernando, my Aunt Carmen, and my Uncle Joe. All alive, all documented with dates and photographs. There was no other Roberto. No dead child. But then I remembered something Aunt Lucia once said at a family dinner years ago about how their mother had a difficult pregnancy before my father was born. How she had been very sick. I never thought twice about that comment until now. At 7 a.m. the next morning, I called Aunt Lucia, the oldest sibling, now 83 but still mentally sharp. I told her what happened with Grandma, and there was a long silence on the other end. "Patricia," she finally said with a tired voice, "there are things we don't talk about in this family, things Mom made us promise never to mention." "But she's sick, Aunt," I argued. "She's saying terrible things, and I need to know if they're true or just hallucinations." Another silence. "Come to my house tomorrow. I'll tell you what I know, but I warn you, you won't like it, and once you know, you won't be able to unknow it. Are you sure you want to open that door?" No, I wasn't sure, but it was already too late. I sat in my aunt's living room, surrounded by family photos that now felt like carefully constructed lies. She served coffee, sat in her armchair, and began to speak. "In 1962, Mom had a baby before your father was born, a boy named Roberto, just like your father was later named. He was 3 years old when he got sick with pneumonia." My stomach twisted. "And what happened?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. "Your grandfather, Tomas, didn't want to spend money on a doctor. We were going through a hard time. He had just lost his factory job. Mom begged him, pleaded with him to take the boy to the hospital, but he said it would pass, that children always get sick. When he finally gave in 3 days later, it was too late. The boy died on the way to the hospital, in Mom's arms." Aunt continued, voice trembling. "After the funeral, which was so small almost no one knew about it, Dad made Mom promise never to speak about Roberto again. Said talking about the dead brought bad luck. But I think it was guilt, pure guilt. My grandfather died 2 years later in that construction accident, and Aunt said she always wondered if he sought that ending himself. Mom was left a widow with 5 kids, well, technically 6 if we count the one we lost, and she never mentioned Roberto again, never. When your father was born, a year after the first boy's death, she named him Roberto too, as if she could replace the one she lost, as if she could erase what happened with a new baby carrying the same name. I felt nauseous. My father had been a replacement for a dead brother no one knew existed. "Is there a photo?" I asked. "Any proof he existed?" Aunt stood slowly, went to her room and returned with an old shoebox full of photographs that smelled like mold and time. She dug to the bottom and pulled out a small faded picture with bent edges. A small boy with honey-colored eyes smiled shyly at the camera. My hands trembled as I took the photo. It was Diego. I mean, it wasn't Diego, but he looked so much like him that he could have been. Same eyes, same face shape, same uneven smile where one corner of the mouth lifted higher than the other. "This is the only one left," Aunt said. "Mom burned all the others after the funeral. I saved this one. I hid it inside my favorite doll because I knew erasing someone like that was wrong." That night I asked my father about his brother. He looked at me with a mix of surprise and anger I'd never seen. "Who told you about that?" he demanded. "Grandma," I said. She had a moment of clarity when she saw Diego. She said things about a boy named Roberto she let die. My father, now 82, a man who had always been so strong, crumbled in front of me. I never knew him, he finally said. I was born a year after he died, but Mom used to call me by his name whenever she was distracted or angry. And when I did something right, she cried. She cried at my graduation, at my wedding, when you were born. And I always knew she wasn't crying for me, but for him, the boy who should have been there but wasn't. I was her son, but I was always the second Roberto, the replacement. Over the next weeks, I became obsessed with the first Roberto story. I searched death records and found one dated August 22nd, 1962. Roberto Martinez Silva, age 3. Cause of death, complications from pneumonia. He really existed. He wasn't a hallucination or a family rumor. He was a real child who lived, got sick, and died because his father refused to spend $200 on a doctor. And his mother had carried that guilt in silence for more than 60 years, until a cruel disease finally freed her from having to keep the secret. I began to see my grandmother differently, not just as the strong matriarch who raised her children alone, but as a woman who lost a child in the most horrific way and then was forced to pretend he never existed. I returned to the nursing home with the photo of the first Roberto in my bag. I needed to show it to her, to see if she would recognize him, if that moment of clarity would return. But when I arrived, the nurse stopped me with a worried expression. She had an episode last week. She became very agitated, shouting about a boy, about fire and fever. We had to sedate her. Since then, she's withdrawn, barely speaks. My heart sank. I had opened that door in her mind, and now she was suffering because of it. I entered her room and found her asleep, her face smaller and more fragile than ever. I took her hand and placed the photograph on her nightstand where she could see it if she woke up. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a miracle, maybe another confession. But she just kept sleeping. My Aunt Carmen, the youngest of the surviving siblings, called me 3 days later. I have something you might be interested in, she said. When we cleaned out Mom's house before moving her to the nursing home, I found an old diary hidden in the attic. I didn't read it at the time because it felt invasive, but now I think you should see it. We met at a cafe, and she handed me a worn notebook with yellowed pages. I opened it with trembling hands and saw my grandmother's handwriting, much firmer and clearer than now. The first entry was dated August 1962. Roberto left today. My baby is gone, and it is my fault for not insisting harder, for not disobeying Tomas and taking him to the doctor myself. I watched him die and did nothing. What kind of mother am I? God will never forgive me. I will never forgive myself. I read the entire diary that night. Each entry was a silent scream of pain that my grandmother had hidden for decades. She wrote about how she saw Roberto in every child who passed by on the street, how she woke up at night hearing his cough, how when my father was born and they named him Roberto again, she felt a mix of hope and horror. Maybe God is giving me a second chance, she wrote. Maybe I can do it right this time. But every time I look at this new Roberto, I see the other one. I see the one I couldn't save. The last entries were the most heartbreaking. They were dated years later, when my father was already an adult. Today, Roberto graduated from college, and I cried. Tomas asked me why, said I should be happy. And I couldn't tell him I cried because the other Roberto will never have this chance. He will never graduate, never marry, never give me grandchildren. I killed him, and now I have to pretend I'm whole. I found myself facing an impossible decision. Should I tell the entire family about the diary and Grandma's confessions? Or should I respect the secret she had guarded so fiercely her whole life? I talked with my husband Marco for hours. He said truth is always better than lies, but I wasn't sure. Sometimes lies protect, sometimes secrets exist for a reason. Besides, what would really change? The first Roberto would still be dead. My father would still be the replacement child, and Grandma would still be trapped in Alzheimer's. But then I thought of Diego, of how Grandma had mistaken him for her dead son. I thought about how that secret had silently shaped our family in ways we were only beginning to understand, and I decided it had to come to light. I organized a family meeting at my house on a Saturday afternoon. All my uncles came, my father, my older cousins. I placed the diary in the middle of the dining room table like a bomb about to explode. I told them everything, from Grandma's confession to what I discovered in the diary. Some cried, others were angry. My Uncle Jose, the youngest, said I had no right to dig up the past, that Mom kept that secret for a reason, and I should respect it. But my father defended me. "She's right," he said firmly. "All my life I felt like I was the shadow of someone else. Now at least I know I wasn't crazy. There was another Roberto, and I was named after him. That explains a lot. Many wounds I never understood." My Aunt Lucia picked up the diary with trembling hands and began to read aloud. The following weeks were difficult for everyone. Some family members blamed me for destroying the family's peace. Others thanked me for finally bringing truth to the surface. I visited Grandma almost every day now, looking for any trace of the woman who wrote that diary full of pain. Sometimes I found her staring at the photograph of the first Roberto that I had left on her nightstand. I'm not sure she knew who the boy in the photo was, but she looked at it with an intensity that broke my heart. One day I approached her and asked directly, "Grandma, do you remember your son Roberto, the first one?" She looked at me with empty eyes for a moment, then slowly nodded. "I let him die. It was my fault." "No, Grandma, it wasn't your fault," I said, holding her hand. "It was the fault of the times, of poverty, of your husband who didn't listen to you, but not you." My father began visiting Grandma more often after the family meeting. One afternoon, I found him sitting beside her bed, holding the photograph of the first Roberto and crying silently. I had never seen him cry before. I sat beside him without saying anything. "She named me Roberto because of him," he finally said. "My whole life, I was the replacement for a dead child. And the worst part is that she could never fully love me because she was always thinking about him." I told him that in the diary, Grandma wrote about how much she loved him, how she tried to be the best mother possible for him precisely because she failed the first one. But he shook his head. "Love born from guilt is not real love. It's a debt you can never pay." That's what I was for her, a way to pay a debt.
2 months after the discovery, Grandma had another moment of clarity. I was alone with her, reading a book even though I wasn't sure she could hear me. Suddenly, she sat up slightly and looked directly into my eyes with a clarity she hadn't shown in years. "Patricia," she said, my name correctly for the first time in months. "Yes, Grandma, I'm here," I replied, emotional. "You found the diary," she stated. It wasn't a question.